foundation, recognizing that in this world, yes, we do have to have responsibility, we have to take responsibility, but our ultimate orientation is to God, and so we must always be cognizant of the presence of God and His influence in the world. The tension for us is that in reality, for most of us as Christians, we have a responsibility, each of us, to be good stewards of the gifts God has given us in light of our responsibilities as students, maybe, as parents, as citizens, parishioners, and the demands that we understand the role of money in our relationship to our faith in Christ. This tension, this dynamic requires that each of us examines with a critical eye the role of economics, specifically, on a micro and macro level, and from this to be able to understand in a more profound way how each of us as Christians can work to improve the world through this generosity of Christ. Tonight I'll also kind of talk about the role of labor, looking at the scriptural foundation for how we understand the dignity of work and its relationship to the state and the marketplace. But I want to focus your attention first to a recent event. Pope Francis visited an island yesterday, or this past Sunday, the island of Sardinia in Italy. And this place has been plagued kind of by downsizing in the industrial complex, and it's seeking to find a place for so many citizens who are out of work, so many citizens who don't have any other skills, so many citizens who are seeking to have an opportunity to earn their wages. And he reminded everyone that in a globalized economic system, the one in which we live, which puts profit at its center, is creating an idol. He used that word, an idol. The world is creating an idol of profit. And we must remember that at the center and foundation of all economic activity is the human person. All economic activity is first oriented towards the human person. And so we must address any injustices in this system, this globalized economic system, with, quote, hope and intelligence. Christ tells us the poor will always be with us. The desire to solve the world's problem of the poor is one that God Himself told us will be with us. So instead of beating ourselves over the head and trying to solve and eliminate poverty completely, because we know it's not going to happen, how do we work to ameliorate that injustice, to bring closer union and solidarity between the rich and the poor, and to help each to recognize in their own dignity the greatness that is in them as God's children? We know that the poor will always be with us. But as the Holy Father himself pointed out in meeting these poor, meeting these people on this island, we must address this situation with hope. We have to bring hope into that situation where it does not exist. We have to bring the redeeming love and mercy of God into those situations where He may not be present. But we also have to do this with intelligence. We cannot keep trying to apply good feelings towards real social problems. We can't keep trying to apply the goodwill of a few individuals when collectively we can manage to do a lot more, but at the same time recognizing our individual responsibility to destroy these problems and these evils in the world. But we have to do it intelligently. And so this evening we'll discuss in an intelligent and respectful manner the Church's social teaching regarding the role of the economy and the role of labor, and how we can respond in Christian charity to the plight of the poor. Even though, honestly, I don't think we're going to get to that part tonight. We'll probably discuss it next week because there's a lot that precedes that. So in the past few weeks, I've usually kind of started with a history of how we've gotten where we are. Well, hopefully that narrative of history has been ground into your mind a little more thoughtfully, and you've given some consideration of the rapid developments in the modern industrial era. But since we do have that picture of the past 100 years, we're going to begin by looking at the Catechism and how it treats this topic. And from that consideration, look at how the historical picture has helped us to better understand what the Church is saying and why she's saying it. The Church responds in her social doctrine to the needs of the times. She gives principles, she gives guidelines, she gives recommendations, but largely they're situated in the circumstances of the time. We didn't need to necessarily see a lot of work coming out of the Vatican, so to speak, in years previous because a lot of these problems didn't exist. But in the modern era, particularly in the past 150 years, she has responded time and time again to the evils that are occurring in the world, trying to give guidance and suggestions to help bring people closer to Christ and closer to one another. So you'll recall the first document that I suggested was called Rerum Novarum. Now, last week only 2 of you have read it. If any more of you taken the undertaking of looking at it some? Okay, so a few more. All right, good, good. So as the kids say, it's called new stuff. That's what Rerum Novarum means, new stuff. And this encyclical focused on the problem of labor in the modern industrial nation. But taking a step back, let's look at the philosophical and theological reasons for the church's teaching on this area. So, the church doesn't get involved willy-nilly in things. She thoughtfully considers why she should even get into, particularly speaking to things that are going on in the world. Her domain is not the world. Her domain, as I said before, first and foremost is the salvation of souls. And so it's a spiritual mission in which she shares. But at times when she recognizes the world, the injustices in the world demand a response, she does. And she begins by looking at if we look at the Catechism, by saying, looking at in the beginning. We see in Exodus and Deuteronomy and the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus uses these words, in the beginning, to remind us of what it was like, what Genesis proposes as a picture of human nature, as a picture of the world. God entrusted, quote, the earth and its resources to the common stewardship of mankind, to take care of them, master them by labor, and enjoy their fruits. So all of the earth's resources, all that was given to us, is entrusted to us for our common stewardship, so individually and collectively. And all those things that were given to us, we are to enjoy the fruits. So to enjoy the fruits of our labor as individuals and again as an organized community, as a society. So the universal destination of goods says that all of this was created for the common good. It was created for all of us. So there is a sense in which everything that is given has a universal character. Its eternal destiny is for all of us in helping us to seek God and to seek the reward of laboring in His vineyard. But these goods are destined for the common good, which we've discussed before, and the whole human race. But we know that the earth is divided up. The earth is divided by nationality. It's divided literally by land masses and oceans. It's divided by other differences. And these differences demand a division in those it demands a division in those properties. It demands a division in those labors. It demands a division in those goods, those things which we are stewards of. And the church says the appropriation of property is legitimate for guaranteeing the freedom and the dignity of persons and for helping each of them to meet his basic needs and the needs of those in his charge. And by that, the church means a man's family. So we see that the appropriation of property is legitimate for guaranteeing the freedom and dignity of persons. That's private property. This is helpful for man to fulfill his basic needs and those in his charge, so his family. It should also allow for a natural solidarity to develop between men. And the church means by this that you may have more of one thing than another, and I may have more of one thing than another, and there's a natural solidarity, not forced by any outside institution, not forced by some, hands or a gun being put to our head and saying you have to give them that can of beans, but a natural solidarity is there between every human person. And we know that to be true because when we see somebody suffering, what do we want to do? We want to help them. Whenever we see a lack in somebody's life that is a real legitimate lack, a need, not something they want, a woman who wants a $5 coffee is a woman who wants a $5 coffee. She doesn't need a $5 coffee. I don't have an obligation to give her $5 coffee. None of us do. But a man who deserves and has a right to have a roof over his head because he works, but he's working so hard and he's not getting paid enough, even though he's doing this great amount of labor, that's an injustice, and that's where we have to step in as an individual and as a church and to recognize those injustices. But the desire for private property does not create a difference in which we can't coexist. Having private property gives us an opportunity to actually practice charity, real charity, what Pope Benedict would call a charism of charity, a charism that leads us outwards of ourselves. And private property permits that opportunity to happen. I'll get into a little bit more as we go through this evening why there are certain systems of thinking, certain systems of governance, which lead to taking away a stripping of private property, actually takes away the opportunity for people to truly be charitable, which is a pretty big philosophical and theological issue. But we see the church bases all this on a universal destination of goods. The goods that are given by God for us to have dominion over are for us to enjoy their fruits, but ultimately to lead us back towards God. And so no perversion of that, any kind of perversion of goods, any kind of perversion of looking at the created order as our ultimate end and destination. So for instance, the goods of, we see in a consumer society, that's a society that's putting this world as its end. And so you can easily distort those goods that are in this world if all your end game is going to be buried 6 feet under the ground and that's it. You can distort your needs and you say, I need this because time's running out. Whereas in reality, time will continue if we are working towards that eternal destination. Church goes on to say, what is at stake is understanding how private property is not opposed to the common good, and in how we as Christians have a responsibility to promote and defend the right to private property while always acknowledging the primordial universal destination of goods. So the church wants to promote the responsibility of Christians to defend the right, and she'll call it a human right in her documents, a human right to private property, but never at the expense of the universal destination of goods. So the church obviously recognizes in humanity that goodness of having our own private property, but she also recognizes our wickedness, our sinfulness. And that's what she's saying. She's reminding that primordial universal destination, that just because we have private property doesn't mean we don't have an obligation to our neighbor, that we don't have an obligation to support the common good being the primary principle of Catholic social teaching. So is that all clear as mud? It's really just about private property. We're going to go on more in depth about private property now, but I just want to understand the relationship for the church is saying private property is a good, it is a human right, but never at the expense of the common good either. So obviously selfishness can become the big issue when you have private property, amassing massive amounts of property and wealth and not sharing it in a just way. And the church has to be honest and address those issues, and she does. But I want to go on a little bit deeper into this private property because there's certainly systems of political thought, systems of economic thought that do believe that private property is evil and that nobody actually has a right to private property. Most commonly those things will be called socialism and communism, but we'll discuss kind of what the reasons the church has stood against this, or has stood for private property and against the destruction of private property historically. In Rerum Novarum, number 5 and 6, probably for those of you who have read it, maybe one of the first paragraphs that caught your attention were these paragraphs. And I've printed them in full because I think it's worthwhile for us to read them. I don't want to read them out loud, so I'm going to give you a moment to read them, and then I'm going to go through a few points of very specific concern for me. And this is number 2, private property and the common good, letter I, or it's 1. So the first paragraph, number 5 there, proposes property and money as being remuneration for the work being done. And that a man in the generic sense, man and woman, has a right to that remuneration, and that they then likewise have a right to use that as they will. And these very, very precise words and very, very specific way of understanding what remuneration is and how it applies to the right for private property, the right for capital, or the right for a wage, we see that giving that right up nullifies the value of one's work. It nullifies the value, the intrinsic connection that one as a person has with their work. Work unto itself only has its dignity in the fact that it's a human being doing the labor. We'll talk about that in a little while, but we recognize that this is a very basic understanding of how labor works. How a person works to obtain money or to obtain land or to obtain some kind of security, and they have a right to use that security and dispose of it as they will. And I did italicize the very specific point I wanted to make. Socialists or socialism, by endeavoring to transfer the possessions of individuals to the community at large, strikes at the interest of every wage earner, since they would deprive him of the liberty of disposing of his wages and thereby of all hope and possibility of increasing his resources and of bettering his condition in life. So that's the first kind of step in explaining why socialism is not compatible with Catholicism in general and specific. It usurps that which was earned by the individual and takes it away from them. So what is a far greater moment, and I think this is the anthropological point, moving on to, is that man by his nature has the right to possess property as his own. It's a reflection of our nature created in the image and likeness of God. We're not animals. We're persons. We're rational beings. So we have the power to direct ourselves. We have the power to use our intellect and our will to the good. We have the power, just like all animals, of self-preservation, of propagation of our species. However, going above and beyond that, we also have the ability to recognize God's presence in our lives, and that we are endowed with a reason that helps us to understand that and helps us to understand how we can use that living presence of God in our lives to help others. Also helps us in understanding this in relationship to the concept of having private property, is that we, as it says, quote, a man must be within his right to possess things, not merely for temporary and momentary use, as other living things do, but to have and to hold them in stable and permanent possession, not only things that perish in the use, but also which, though they have been reduced into use, continue for further use and after time. So having that sense of we are created in a different way. We are created in a way in which our minds, their gift of reason, our intellect, helps us to use things, helps us to use our property, helps us to use our wages in a way that helps to reflect our dignity as persons is very important. The anthropological reason that we stand above the brutes, we stand above the animals who are in constant need of correction, whereas we have the ability to, as persons, rationally deliberate and make decisions. It is rightful that we have that opportunity. To take that opportunity away from us denies us our freedom. It denies us our ability to think for ourselves and to use things as we see fit, and justice, and to use those things to help others who are without. Private property in Vatican II says very much the same thing, that though it doesn't dwell so much on the anthropological reason. It says, quote, since property and other forms of private ownership of external goods contribute to the expression of personality, and since, moreover, they furnish one an occasion to exercise its function in society and the economy, it is very important that the access of both individuals and communities to some ownership of external goods be fostered. Private property or some ownership of external goods confers on everyone a sphere wholly necessary for the autonomy of the person and the family, and it should be regarded as an extension of human freedom. Lastly, since it adds incentives for carrying on one's function and charge, it constitutes one of the conditions for civil liberties. This connection between private property and ownership and the autonomy of the person and his family connects to one of those non-negotiables we talked about 2 weeks ago with Pope Benedict. Remember when he talked about how one of the non-negotiables in Catholic social teaching is the right for the family to educate their own child. If all of our property, all of our intellectual and real capital is given over to the state, if we have no means, if we don't have the means to build our own home, to buy our own books, how can we educate our own children? If that is all given over to some other institution, how can we do that? So this is where you see a connection between private property and the ability to educate children, the ability to foster and propagate the species. So private property does not present an evil. However, we do realize that man, driven by evil instincts at times, driven by a desire of selfishness and a lust for life that is not real or doesn't accord with his dignity, there is times where society does have to step in and help regulate the sharing of goods. It does, and we'll talk about what that looks like in justice. Does it look like taking from everybody what they've done and what they've earned and then distributing it? No, because that's not right. Doesn't accord with our dignity. It doesn't accord with the work that you've done. Some work is better than others because some work will have much greater effects. Some people will be rewarded more greatly for their work because of its greater effects and its influence on society. Is that wrong? No. It's justice. It's not fairness, because fairness is not a virtue that we see in the economy. Fairness is not a virtue actually in Christian life at all. Justice is a virtue. And recognizing the difference between the two is very important. Fairness is a good thing, and fairness can help us to make prudential judgments, but virtue of justice is demanding that which is somebody's due. And there is a real justice in private property that accords with the relationship of labor and the wages earned or the property earned, or however that remuneration occurs. Our Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, and our Holy Father, Pope Benedict XVI, both wrote at length on this topic and in different encyclicals. Blessed John Paul II wrote in Centesimus Annus in 1991 about the evils of private property in regards to the modern democratic state, recognizing that there are people that have amassed more than any country could have ever amassed, and acknowledging that there is a great greed that comes with this free market capitalism, and recognizing that there can be a great and egregious abuse of private property and of the Church's understanding of wage. And likewise, Pope Benedict says the same thing and reiterates that we have to look at those moments to instill this charism of charity, this desire to really inspire people to be gratuitous. Not just to be generous, but to be gratuitous in their generosity. To be very much magnanimous in their generosity. To completely give of themselves and recognize in that giving their own actual dignity. The Church will go on to speak a little bit about the respect for goods of others, because she recognizes that when private property is amassed, when wages are amassed, you can start to see injustices occurring. You can certainly start to see injustices occurring. So the respect for the goods of others. This is all put in the context of the seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal. This includes the following: a deliberate retention of goods lent or objects lost. How many times have we done that? Business fraud, paying unjust wages, forcing up prices by taking advantage of the ignorance or hardship of another, work poorly done, tax evasion, price inflation for the purpose of gains. I almost never hear this in confession. I wish I did. People sometimes say, well, Father, kids say, I stole, some money from my mom or dad. Not a good thing. But, I'd love to hear an adult actually say, well, I haven't done my taxes in like 3 years because I don't believe in our tax system. Well, that's wonderful, but why are you not paying your taxes? Is it some kind of perceived injustice? Well, we need to talk about that. We need to realize paying our taxes, you're not committing yourself to any grave evil. You're following the commands of God as He has given them to us. We have something we owe to Caesar. He says, give to Caesar that which is his due. So let's talk about why you're avoiding taxes. Are you avoiding taxes because you're afraid the IRS is going to be finding out about you stealing tons of stuff and not reporting things? Because then that's also a sin. It's not just that you're avoiding taxes, but now you're also deceiving other people. So we've got to be willing to recognize that sometimes with private property, with the amassing of our own wages and our wealth, there can become these imbalances. And also, I would love it, and I'm sure some of you older folks would probably agree with me, I'd love to hear somebody confess they haven't worked hard. 99.9% of the time, and I'm guilty of it, I'm always working, I'm always tired. Well, most people in an 8-hour day job actually work about 5 hours. And that's being generous. 4. I'm getting 4 from the church workers, it's 4. But the reality is that's a sin, because you have a responsibility to you're the business owner to give them a just day of work. they're giving you a just wage, hopefully. Price inflation for the purpose of gains. This is something we often see with those who own businesses or those who own large shares in the economy. These are not being respectful of each other, and in relationship to private property, people who own more, or who make more tend to be guilty of some of these violations against the seventh commandment. So just kind of bringing that relationship out, because sometimes we feel like maybe private property or social property, or however that all works out, has nothing to do with, our own moral well-being. But no, in fact, it's wrapped up in that intimate relationship of our conscience. And we recognize that some of these things we may do, like the deliberate retention of goods lent or objects lost, deliberately not doing anything to return those things, is a sin. And it kind of builds up. We know sin continues to divide. So the more we imbibe in these kinds of sins, the more difficult it is for us to see the good that is around us, particularly the good of how we can see a just relationship with private property. The church speaks of justice in regards to money and property, and this is a very particular teaching that is helpful for us, because sometimes we kind of use the slogan social justice to talk about all these issues. The church, because she's awesome and she's a mother, and I've been chewed out by my mom, she uses her words very wisely. The church uses her words very wisely to talk about justice in regards to money and property. And she says there are three kinds of justice that we need to be careful of, and when it comes to this topic of money, property, and the individual and the human good. Commutative justice regulates exchanges between person and between institutions in accordance with strict respect for their rights. So this really has a lot to do with contracts, verbal and written. This has to do with just seeing a very explicit kind of justice. If you agree to a contract to work for $50,000 a year, you will work for $50,000 a year. You're going to work for 48 weeks of a 52-week year. Strict justice, this commutative justice, demands that that relationship be upheld. The church will go on to say something which I thought, the first time I read it years ago, I thought was incredible, but the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. Without this type of justice, no other justice is actually possible. If we can't see justice in the most basic forms of relationships, we will not be able to know what really justice actually looks like. So just an example I can think of very easily off the top of my head would be that working relationship. Anytime we see somebody enter into a contract, they expect remuneration for the work that they've done. When that work does not occur, the person who engaged that contract, the owner, the business owner, or whomever, has a right to not pay that person because that person didn't follow through on their contract. But if they did, they have a responsibility to pay that person. These are the kinds of things that generally get overlooked. We kind of take for granted that everybody is going to actually follow through on these things, when quite the opposite is, I think, unfortunately true these days. A lot of people back out of contracts. A lot of people don't actually fulfill what is asked of in their contracts. And so we see the growth of a particular type of law practice where, we see contract law and litigation, corporate litigation growing and growing because people are actually not fulfilling their responsibilities. And when they're not able to fulfill these most basic responsibilities, like waking up and going to my job every day, how are they going to know what justice looks like when they see it in the street, when they see an injustice around them, because we're not able to fulfill the most common of those types of justice. The second justice the church will speak about is legal justice, which concerns what citizens owe in fairness to the community. So, I think I used this example last week, and it's positive law. So, a speed limit of 75 miles an hour. We owe that in fairness to the community so that we don't hurt other people. It's a matter of being responsible. Legal justice is generally looking at what is from the individual going upwards, although sometimes we do see the opposite. We see what the larger owes to the smaller, but this is most often called distributive justice, though the two in our country particularly can be used sometimes one for the other. But distributive justice is that which regulates what the community owes its citizens in proportion to their contributions and their needs. I bring all this up, this very specific language, because I would encourage you, if you're ever teaching the faith, if you're ever talking to somebody, and really honestly to go into the catechism and read more about it. The number is right there. Because social justice is a slogan that really doesn't have, it has such a broad definition for most people. We need to talk about justice in a very specific way to address very specific problems. Social problems in the world demand justice, yes, but different types of justice for different types of problems, and to be conscious of how that language actually has an impact on what we're doing as a church. Finally, the church will talk about being mindful of any acts or enterprises that for any reason, selfish or ideological, commercial, or totalitarian, that lead to an enslavement of human beings to be sought, to their being bought, sold, or in exchange like merchandise in disregard for their personal dignity. So this is talking about human trafficking, basically, and slavery. The church obviously stands out. It's in vogue to be against those things because most of us recognize that it's an egregious affront to human dignity and human rights to not be against those things. But just again, recognizing that these actions, like these enterprises, these businesses that are involved in those things, don't have any, there's no sense of the common good in any of those things. There's no sense of a proper ordering, of a just wage, obviously, of anything like that, or any kind of idea of how the individual relates to the community and the community relates to the individual. And we have to be aware of that because there is a growing trend of kind of ignoring this problem, the problem of human slavery and human trafficking. And unfortunately, it's very present even right here in Tyler. We know we live on an interstate system in America. It's very easy to move people around. So to just not be ignorant of that and recognize that we have a responsibility as Christians to help fight against these kinds of these human trafficking and slavery kind of enterprises. I wanted to go on to finish on a point about about the right ordering of creation and understanding that we as human beings are at the top of the created order. And so everything, as we said before, is given to us to enjoy, to use for our well-being, to enjoy the fruits of our labors, so to speak. And so we have an ecological openness that said, our ecological theology. We want to be responsible with the land. We want to be responsible with animals, all of those things. There's a right ordering, and certainly we want to always be respectful. It's a violation. It's not a violation of the animal's dignity to treat an animal like garbage. It's a violation of our dignity. You're human beings. We are human beings. We shouldn't treat animals poorly because it degrades us. First and foremost, we don't need to do bad things to animals. We don't need to destroy the world around us to make us feel better, because that does not make any sense. It's a violation of our dignity. But I want to make a point, number 2418 in the Catechism of the Catholic Church is very specific, and this is just it's a bit of a pet peeve, I'll be honest with you, but it's something that we have to be aware of. You can't be pro-animal and not be pro-life. Just pure and simple. You can be both, and you should be both. We want to protect animals. We don't want to destroy bald eagles and baby seals. Wonderful. But if that is your biggest priority in this side of earth, or this side of heaven, please reconsider your priorities. This should always be below our pro-life initiatives in the life of the church. It's not compatible with our Catholic faith to be pro-animal and not be pro-life. You can't reconcile one with the other. And as I said before, there are those things in our faith which we cannot negotiate on. Can people be very pro-life and also be part of PETA? Absolutely. As the rector would say, knock yourself out. If you've got the energy to do both of those things, God bless you. I know from doing pro-life work, it's pretty taxing. So the idea of going out and do that again for animals the next day, I don't know if I'd have the energy for it. But just understanding the church is very clear on this. And it's not because she doesn't love animals, but it's understanding there is a hierarchy in the created order. And we are at the top of that hierarchy. God created us in His image and likeness. He didn't create apes in His image and likeness. He didn't create seagulls in His image and likeness. He created human beings in that image and likeness. So I now want to move on to the role of the economy and marketplace. But before I do, is there any questions about the role of private property? Are we clear as to why private property is a good to be desired? It's a basic human good. It's something what the church will actually call a human right. I think we're all in agreement private property is a good thing. We're also all in agreement that the egregious abuses that people have brought about through the use of private property and the amassing of wealth does demand demands justice, and it demands a response. However, to take that away from them by force won't actually help that person grow in any charity. And in fact, it can create the opposite. It can create avarice and malice, even more so towards other human beings when they have their goods taken away from them. So I want to move on to the delicate relationship of the church and the economy and the marketplace. I say delicate because really the church is not going to propose models of economics. It's really not. Why should she? It's not her role. It's not her authority, again, is a spiritual authority first and foremost. But she does study the human person. She interacts with human history. She's constantly aware and part of human history. And so she will offer suggestions and guidelines. And she says very clearly, this is in our catechism and also in Centesimus Annus, and this is restating what's been stated before, any system in which social relationships are determined entirely by economic factors is contrary to the nature of the human person and his acts. And so, any economic system, capitalism, free market capitalism, closed market capitalism, limited market capitalism, communism, socialism, whatever ism you want to throw on there, any economic system where social relationships are entirely determined by economic factors is contrary to our human nature, because that means that all we are workers. And we have no dignity outside of the work we do, which means the foundation is not us as human beings, it's not the human person as the foundation of society, it's work as the foundation of society. And so we have to be very mindful of that. Clear statement of the church. Any economic system where economic factors are the sole purpose or the sole foundation of that social relationship or that society is not one that is compatible with our faith. So we'll move on. Today more than ever before, attention is given to the increase of the production of agriculture and increased industrial goods and the rendering of services for the purpose of making provisions for the growth of population and satisfying the increasing desires of the human race. This was written in 1965. This is Gaudium et Spes. Recognizing that the world is becoming, as it's becoming a globalized economy, we're starting to see that greater interdependence and independence within the world. We're also seeing a very steep rise in how we produce industrial and agricultural goods, and also the growth of the service industry, which really heretofore, prior to the 1900s, really was not the biggest industry. It was actually probably the smallest part of a global economic system, but now it's, I think, the second highest after industry is the service sector. So recognizing that that's on the rise, we also see the technical progress as an inventive spirit and eagerness to create and to expand enterprises. All these things are being promoted. But, quote, the fundamental finality of this production and I prefer, actually, it's one of the rare times I'm going to say I do prefer this translation because it speaks a little bit more to the specifics of economics and specifically on economic systems. It says, the fundamental finality of this production is not the mere increase of products, nor profit or control, but rather the service of man, and indeed the whole man, with regard to all, with regard for the full range of his material needs and the demands of his intellectual, moral, and spiritual life. This applies to every man whatsoever, and to every group of men of every race and of every part of the world. So we don't look to an economic system to be just about profit or just about goods. We look at it to be in service to all that is the human being. The ultimate, this translation says, the ultimate and basic purpose of economic production is not just in the increase of goods produced, nor in profit or prestige. So it's kind of defining an economic system by what it's not. It's not just there for the means of greed. It's not just there for the means of amassing private property. It's not just there for the means of amassing material goods. All economic systems, all work should be oriented towards the overall good of the human being, which includes their intellectual, their moral, their spiritual, and religious life. So an economic system that does not operate in that realm, an economic system that exclusively works for the purpose of gaining capital, or exclusively for the purpose of gaining more property, or exclusively for the purpose of gaining more power, is not one that is in accord with our human dignity. And so it goes on to say, economic activity is to be carried on according to its own methods and laws within the limits of the moral order. So economic activity fundamentally is a moral reality. And that's why the church steps in and talks to the world about the economy and the marketplace. This is why the church opens her mouth on areas like capitalism, on areas like socialism, on areas like communism, on areas like the exploitation of human persons, on areas like human trafficking. Why? Because it's a moral issue. It's not just some out there kind of issue that we've made up. It's a real life moral issue that has good and bad to it, that has human beings at the basis of it. And Pope Benedict, in his encyclical on human development, said, the economy is oriented towards what he calls integral human development. And this development of the human person is ultimately one in which, as the word indicates, integral, takes in and accounts for all of us. So an economy that doesn't take into account the spiritual reality of a human being, the fact that we have a soul, an economy that doesn't take in our emotional reality, the fact that we have a psychology, we have a mind and a heart that are all interacting. Any kind of economy that doesn't look at the totality of the human person is not a real economy, and it's one that we should be fighting against at all times. He also goes on to say, though, and I think it's very important for us to hear this, quote, a vocation is a call that requires a free and responsible answer. Integral human development presupposes the responsible freedom of the individual and of peoples. No structure can guarantee this development over and above human responsibility. So we realize that the economy is not going to do this perfectly. The economy can't provide for all my spiritual, my material, my psychological, my emotional, all of those needs perfectly. The assumption of the church is that each of us individually is also working for those things. That we are working in an economy to better those realities. That if they are not present in the economy in which you live, you will take to task the responsibility you have to speak to those realities. To bring up into maybe the work environment. You know, boss, I've noticed that you pay us decently, you give us vacation, but we don't have any time to improve our minds. You know, it's just constantly work, work, work. Where's the opportunity for me to learn more about my particular field? This is usually called continuing ed. As a priest, I have to have it. Most doctors have to have it. I think most legal professionals have to have it. But, let's say like my dad, he's a welder. 44 years of welding. I don't think one time they offered, hey, here's a class on advanced welding 102 or something like that. He may have known everything already, but the reality is he worked in an economy, had a working condition that was unjust. It didn't seek to improve his intellect and improve his state in life. We need to look at how we as individuals can take responsibility to help make our economy here in the States one that really looks at integral human development. And sometimes that's going to mean stepping back from micro issues like the injustices we may perceive in specific corporations. I could name a few examples, but I'm being recorded, so I won't. But looking at those specific examples, looking at injustice you see in a microcosm and applying remedies at a macrocosm. So, for instance, how do we enact a law, or how do we enact this idea or mentality that every corporation should have times of retreat for their employees? Well, we don't look for the government to regulate that for us. As individuals, you go up and talk to the boss and say, hey boss, we could use some time together that's not in our workplace. There's a great show, Duck Dynasty, you're probably familiar with, or you've heard about it. It's very popular. I remember seeing an episode. He did a corporate retreat. Those guys do the same thing every day. They're family members. They know each other very well. But he recognized, hey, we got to get out of our workplace sometimes and just get together. But we don't look to the the government to do that for us. We as individuals take responsibility and propose that and see how, see if it's taken. If we see that it's not taken, it's not accepted, if our boss, our superiors say, no, that's a stupid idea and a waste of money, that's when you can take it, maybe organize it, maybe you're part of a union, maybe you're not, maybe there's somebody, a human resource manager you can go to. But addressing macro level problems has to happen at a micro level, and micro level problems need to be addressed at the macro level at the same time. But it's going to start with that development from below and going upwards instead of looking upwards and saying, do this, do this. It creates a mentality of basically, I don't have to be responsible for my own well-being anymore. You see how that works out. So, I want to go on to talk about the state and the economy, particularly the relationship between the state and the marketplace, what that looks like. I will be talking very particularly about communism, socialism, and capitalism. But before I do that, let's take a 3.5-minute break. Your notes are a little bit more kind of in lockstep at this point. I have to expand a lot on the notes that you have, and I have a lot of notes here. The reality is, and it's always, as a speaker you have to say this, there's so much more that could be said, and the reality is I'm trying to give you a synthesis and an introduction, and a basic introduction, because the church has, volumes on this that are very, very, very insightful. Pope John Paul II's critique in Centesimus Annus, it's numbers 30 through 44, knocks it out of the park. I'm really just I'm synthesizing mostly what he said in there, but if you want to read something that has philosophy, history, economics, and brings all that to bear on the gospel and the gospel bearing on it, that's where I would encourage you to go. But we want to move through this kind of systematically so we can get to the kind of setup for next week's discussion on social justice. So we'll start with the state and the economy. Ideally, there's a relationship between these two in which the economy in service to the common good, which we talked about, and the state, which is in service to the common good, which we've also spoken of, will be corresponding. Now, the economy as the marketplace doesn't have necessarily a human conscience. And so the state provides somewhat of that human consciousness to a market. And so there is an idea of limited regulation within the social teaching of the church. But we want to talk about what those extremes of regulation can look like, or lack of regulations can look like. The first is communism and socialism. The ideal. A good idea in a lot of ways. And I know I got some curious looks right away. Just being realistic. This rose during a time where the division of rich and poor became sharper than it ever had previously. Now, it's much worse. We've seen that the reality is socialism and communism could lead to a much even greater discrepancy between the rich and the poor, as can a capitalism that's completely unbridled and greedy. But during the times, they were trying to address some serious issues. The problems of the rich and the poor, the problem of reducing alienation. There were people who literally just didn't feel like they belonged anywhere because they were so alienated by those of a different social class or those who did even a different job. Reducing selfishness. There were, in the time of the Industrial Revolution and afterwards, the rising modern industrial era, we saw selfishness at expansive levels. The amassing of land, the amassing of wealth, in epic proportions. There are now people who are much more egregious, we have to realize, with their amassing of land and wealth than ever before. And this is 100 years after the problem, 150 years after the problem is trying to be solved. And finally, reducing human difference. And this is a point where we can disagree explicitly. Difference is okay. You're a woman, I'm a man. That's a difference that's perfectly natural, perfectly ordered by God. There's nothing wrong with it. There are differences in skin color. There are differences in people's abilities to do things. Those differences are what make you uniquely a son and a daughter of God. There's nothing wrong with those differences. So the idea that everybody has to look the same, act the same, and smell the same, go to the same school, speak the same language, that's not compatible with how we were created in the image and likeness of God. There's distinctions in the Trinity. The persons of the Trinity are God, Father, Son, and Spirit. And that's okay to have those distinctions. It helps us to understand the magnanimity of God, the generosity of God, the life of God, and understanding the life of the Trinity. And there's going to be differences. Distinctions and differences are two words. There are differences in human beings that don't make us so different, but they do make us unique, and they give us an opportunity to reflect upon the greatness of God and seeing, beautiful silver hair, beautiful dark brown hair, beautiful blonde hair, sandy brown hair. Those are differences that don't make you worse or better than anybody else. And recognizing that differences are okay is a good thing. Communism and socialism generally and very explicitly at times wanted to eliminate differences. And I don't have to tell you those times because all of you have hopefully read a history book and heard about them. But the reality of what communism and socialism brought to the world, and we have to be very honest with ourselves. I'm not out to pick a fight with anybody. I'm a student of life, a student of human nature, a student of history, but we can very definitely point to all of these things coming to bear in the rise of communism and socialism. The states became rich. The states became the authority. The states have all the wealth now. The states have all the property now. The state is God. That's a problem. That's a big, big, big problem. And I know most of you agree with me, but just saying it out loud, the state is God. The state has all the property. The state has all the wealth. The state is going to dictate how all of that's distributed. Well, who's the state? What guides the state? How does the state know what's good for the human being? So we see the scariness of that immediately. It also, in the transitions particularly, a lot of individuals got real wealthy. In communist states and in socialist states, there's an elite group of people in that transition who will amass incredible amounts of wealth. And guess what? They don't want to give it up. They will not want to give it over to the state. So what happens? 9 times out of 10, we don't even get to this idealistic communist state because now we've got 8 or 10 people who have all kinds of way crazy amounts of wealth and property who don't want to give it up to the state, and so the rest, they'll battle it out for the next 40 years. And they'll have coups, and they'll have military juntas, and all kinds of fun situations. Meanwhile, the other 99%, so to speak, as we like to say here in America, have nothing. They have no property, they have no rights, they have no money to help better their situation. So that's just the transition stage. We see that in the transition, a lot of individuals will become wealthy, and eventually the state becomes the wealthiest. The state becomes that which has all the property and all the money. Secondly, in addressing the problem of rich and poor, people are no longer capable of a true self-gift. Pope John Paul II talked about this, very specifically critiquing Marxism. What happens when you no longer feel compelled to help somebody because you know that there's some social system that's going to help them? I mean, there's a few of you who are in here who work in St. Vincent de Paul Society. People expect you to give them stuff. That's the reality. And that's what happens when you have a nanny state, so to speak, that takes away the ability of individuals to actually practice charity. I preached about this yesterday. We don't know the person on the other side of our 6 or 8 foot fence. And really, a lot of us would rather build it 10 or 12 feet high. That way we really never have to see what those people are doing over there. But if I live in a country where the country I know is going to take care of that guy, if something bad happens, I don't ever have to practice charity. And what do? I turn completely in on myself. It's all about me, what I want to do, when I want to do it. I no longer have a desire to give myself to others in freedom and in charity, to give myself in charity and in love to them. And so it takes away our ability to look at others as a gift of God and to give to them that which is their due. It's strictly speaking, it denies us the ability to love. A communist state will ultimately take away from the individual their ability to love another person. And so that's a great evil, because God is love. We're created in that image and likeness of God's love. And so our inability, you see that some people tried, like let's think of St. Maximilian Kolbe, put into a very nasty situation in which a rising regime of basic socialism was coming to the fore, and he was trying to exercise charity in basically in a gas chamber. He managed to exercise that charity, and he died for it. But that's a heroic act of virtue. And what was the payment for his heroic act of virtue? Death. To do a good thing, he was rewarded with death. You can't live in a society that rewards good deeds with death. And that's unfortunately what happened for so many people in that generation. Next, kind of corresponding to reducing alienation, we see in communist and socialist nations, goods are guarded with great violence and hoarding. If you had something that the state didn't get from you, you protected it with your life. You literally sometimes would shoot somebody if they came into your backyard and asked for a cigarette because you knew that was the only cigarette you had. That's what can happen when your rights, when all these goods are taken away from you, when your possessions are no longer your own. It creates also, you saw like in Cuba for instance, hoarding, tons of hoarding of particular goods that that the state somehow or another managed to overlook or just didn't really bat an eye because they were people in power. But we see this kind of hoarding which is going to create, division, and ultimately those people who know you're hoarding all those great things, they're going to come over and kill you because they want your stuff. And that does not create a society that is seeking justice and seeking to have a just distribution of wealth and goods. Finally, the fourth point is the nastiness of what, this is quoting Pope Francis, an egalitarian utopia. An egalitarian utopia, that means an equal utopia, a world where we're all the same. He said that is nasty because it's not in accord with our human nature. Think about it. If we were all the same, what joy would there be? I mean, if you all had to listen to me and talk like me all the time, boy howdy, I'd feel sorry for you people. But this egalitarian utopia is not real, and it's not ever going to be real. Unfortunately, this side of heaven, we do know that division will abound because sin abounds. But grace abounds the more, and we do know that too. We know that Christ will put himself over all of us if we invite him in. But if we look to the government, if we look to the market to reduce these human differences, it doesn't permit us to actually see in the other person the image of God that's in them. It reduces that indifference by making us all, or they're reducing those differences by making us all look, act, speak, and think exactly the same. So those are the 4 points that correspond. A fifth reason why the reality of why communism and socialism doesn't work is because it's atheistic. Make no bones about it. It's atheistic. Even if they say, well, no, there's room for God in this system. Ultimately, what happens to people who believe in God in a socialist economy? Ultimately, what happens to people who believe in God in a communist economy? They're killed, or they're pushed out. They can no longer live in that economy. So it's purposefully atheistic. They'll sometimes guise themselves as being humanistic. The total answer to you as human beings is to give you a humanistic communism. Well, a humanistic communism is okay, but it still denies what? God. So it will always be incompatible with our nature because we are creatures who have a soul that desires to be united with God. And so that is a very, very good reason to not fall into the trap of communism and socialism. Secondly is obviously that there's no transcendentalism to it at all. Good, beauty, those kinds of things, truth, they don't exist anymore. Because everything is right here. It's one playing field. This is it. There's nothing beyond this. There's nothing below this. It's all right here. So there's no transcendental to our life anymore. So I always like to pick on art because I love beautiful things. A crucifix that looks like this is beautiful. Why? Because it incorporates proportion, elegance, lines, dynamic, shading, all those great things, and it brings in the human person of Jesus Christ. 2 sticks, and I don't mean like a cross, I mean just like 2 bars of like rebar, that's not as beautiful, and that's objectively true. That is more beautiful than 2 sticks of rebar. Why? Because we know what beauty looks like. We've been given the answer to beauty in the person of Christ. But if we live in a state where everything is the same and where it all ends right here, what's the purpose of doing anything good or beautiful or seeking truth? Because everything is just going to end here, today, and now. Thirdly, false presuppositions about human nature. The basic presupposition about human nature of communism and socialism is that we don't have the ability to be good. That we as human beings have such a corrupted nature that we will never actually be able to share with each other in a way that is just. We'll never actually be able to respect each other in a way that is just because we're so dang bad. I think I used the reference snow-covered dung heaps a couple weeks ago. That's not what we believe. We believe we're good, first and foremost. We're created in God's image. God means good. So we are good. And yes, we are plagued by concupiscence, but we know that we can overcome that through self-mastery. We know we can overcome that through a life of virtue, a life of truth. And so we don't look at ourselves with this dim notion that we're all idiots who can't manage to get out of a maze, but that we can, both as individuals and collectively, help each other to get out of that maze. And so that presupposition about our human nature is being bad. Another one, and maybe even more specific to our time and our day, is the false presupposition that labor gives humanity its dignity. That somehow or another work is what makes me special. And we all kind of fall into that, right? I mean, men particularly, that mental trap of, I identify myself by what I do. Who are you? You're a human being. That's what makes you amazing. That's what makes you a miracle. That's what makes you the most wonderful thing in God's creation. Not the fact that you're a steel worker or a candle maker or a priest. What makes me and you amazing is our humanity. And we give dignity to the work we do by entering into it freely and with great desire. Are there any questions regarding communism, socialism, and why the church stands in opposition to those forms of economy, that form of economy, and the relationship between state and market? Okay. The church's statements reiterate what I've just said. I kind of, like I said, I did a synthesis of a number of different documents. The Catechism puts it very succinctly. And if you take nothing else away, take these 2 things away. A system that subordinates the basic rights of individuals and of groups to the collective organization of production is contrary to human dignity. It's communism, socialism. The church has rejected the totalitarian and atheistic ideologies associated in modern times with communism and socialism. She also speaks about capitalism very specifically. In Centesimus Annus, which is the document by Blessed John Paul II, in number 40, I think 40 and 44, speaks very specifically to this. But a greedy capitalism, or a capitalism that puts profit as the be-all and end-all, is not compatible with our faith either. It says, quote, "She has likewise refused to accept in the practice of capitalism individualism and the absolute primacy of the law of the marketplace over human labor." So what does that mean? Individualism, so this irrational attachment to self and all of our own glory. I can't remember the name of who's the telecom guy from Mexico? Sorry? Fox. No, not Vicente Fox. He was president. There's the telecom guy from Mexico. He's the wealthiest man in the world. He's got like Carlos Slim, yeah. That guy has focused a little bit too much on the individual. It's fair to say. I'm not being mean, it's just a reality. It's a judgment of his actions. What has he done to share the immense amount of wealth that he has? Nothing. He's known to be a relatively selfish person. Is he bad? No, he's a human being, so there's goodness there. He's chosen to make a lot of bad decisions. Primacy of law of the marketplace over human labor. This is what we've seen in America. We've been so hell-bent on capitalism as the greatest and best thing to ever happen that we've not had an opportunity to look at how the free market capitalism in our country has affected people. It's not to say that we have to swing way to the other side and abandon and have the most heavily regulated capitalism in the world. The church doesn't believe in that either. But we have to look at how the economic system has worked in favor of or against human dignity. So we ask the question, is there a third way? Well, there is, and really that third way is a limited free market capitalism. This is not Catholic social doctrine. I want to make that caveat. This is the proposal that's been accepted generally by the popes for the past 70 years or so, is some kind of limited market free capitalism, or limited regulation free market capitalism, because it's an idea that permits the greatest amount of individual and collective activity towards the common good. It has to be regulated, it has to be looked at and analyzed over and over again to recognize the evils that have crept in. But she's not going to propose anything else. She doesn't propose really, in reality, she doesn't propose these systems and say, this is what you have to do. Blessed John Paul II has been noted a number of times as actually saying a benevolent monarchy would be his preference. A benevolent monarchy in America, can you imagine? I mean, it is a good idea. I believe it. St. Thomas Aquinas was a big fan of benevolent monarchy too. But we are so bound to our capitalist idea and our free market economy and this democracy that we're very wedded to it. But we can't do that with any sense of irrationality. We have to be willing to call a spade and recognize when that system is not acting in accordance with the common good and human dignity. So, that third way, something you need to think about and pray about and study. I promise you, there is great activity in Catholic economics. You can go to Catholic University of America and I think you can get a doctorate in Catholic economics. We're looking to put ourselves into those places in Washington, D.C. and throughout the world to help influence the markets, with Christ's love. But it takes a lot of initiative on our own parts to study in our own lives. What's our relationship to this economy? What's our relationship and activity within this economy? How do we use money? Because ultimately the church is always going to, what she demands of the collective, she is going to demand of every individual too. So I want to finish this evening by talking about the worker. Now I want to tell a very personal story about why this has meant so much to me. As I mentioned, my dad was a welder for 44 years at one company. That's pretty much unheard of. He did not ever lose his job. He had to sit for, I think, 3 weeks while everybody else was striking. He wasn't actively striking. He was sitting at home. Being a smart labor union guy, he just sat at home and let the other guys go stand around and picket. But my dad worked for 44 years as a still worker and a die-hard voting Democrat because it was the Union Party. And he and I have had a chance over the course of the past 10 years or so to kind of discuss what work meant to him, what it meant to me in my life growing up, what it really means to all of us as people. He grew up on a small farm in central Texas. His dad died when he was 16, and my dad, from the age of about 6, was doing something on the farm and going to school. When his dad died, he and his mom sold the farm the year at the end of that school year, and he got away from the farming business. He did a little work every day to keep basically milk on the table. But after he did 2 years of service for the country, he entered into a profession that he really had. I mean, he just went to trade school, got a welding degree, and didn't know what it was going to be. And that work provided for him and my family the rest of our lives the comfort of knowing that I knew I was going to have a roof over my head. I knew I was going to have food in my belly, and I knew that basically my life was going to be taken care of. My dad was not wealthy, nor does he certainly claim to be wealthy at this point. But very clearly instilled in my life was a desire to imitate my father, because he was the hardest working guy I knew. My mom, likewise, a hard-working lady, worked her buns off and continues to work now. But what it instilled in me was a desire to understand why do I want to work? I mean, as a teenager, I had 2 jobs, and I went to school, and it wasn't so that I didn't have spending habits. I didn't have time to spend my money because I was working. But what's the meaning of work? Well, my dad didn't get his value and his dignity because he was such a great welder. He brought himself into that steel mill every day. And he brought Christ into those lives of those people he worked with every day. It wasn't that being a steel worker made him great. It's that he is a good man, and he made steelworking an honorable profession. And that kind of seeped in. That's the analogy I can use for you. If you're an employee, it's not that the work you're doing is so awesome. It's that you're awesome. You make that work amazing. Now, some work has higher ends and aspirations and goals, and those things are to be lauded. But a street sweeper or a nuclear physicist, it's not that what they do is so great. It's who they are that makes it so great. So that's what the church understands about work. We're created in church, what it says specifically is we're created in His image and likeness. And God gave us the authority to have dominion over the entire earth. That's awesome, because it gives everything at our disposal to give back to God in praise. But also, we find our dignity, or we find work as having its dignity because of its effect in the social state and helping others, helping to bring charity into the realities of the world that are lacking charity. She says that human work proceeds from the persons created in the image of God and prolonging the work of God's creation, of subduing the earth both with and for one another. And it's a duty. We read in sacred Scripture, if anyone will not work, let him not eat. And so we have a duty, a responsibility as Christians to be people who work. St. Paul. And work honors the Creator's gifts and the talents received from Him. And this work can be redemptive. The sufferings that you endure and the labors that you undertake can be part of that co-redeeming work of Christ in the world through His church and through us, His body. But we understand that work can be also a means of sanctification and how we bring Christ into all those temporal realities in which we are engaged. And it's on that note that I'd like to speak a little bit about this guy, St. Jose Maria Escrivá, the founder of Opus Dei. His life's mission was to help lay people recognize that their work can be a great place of sanctification. We often don't approach our work with that idea, do we? We look at our work begrudgingly. Maybe even you like your work, but you don't always look at it as an opportunity for prayer. And he instructed us and continues through his writings and his preaching to instruct us to recognize in every moment and every day that there's an opportunity to give praise back to God through the very work that we're doing, to finding how you can put God into every situation of your day, to make even the most inane things, like being on the internet and looking at my Facebook page so that I can make sure that my family gets to see pictures of me. It's not something I really want to do. I don't like pictures. I don't like taking them. I don't like looking at them. But I know it makes my family happy, and it's something where I know Christ can be part of that relationship because I just show them all the pictures of me doing church stuff. So we have to see how we can bring work into Christ and Christ into our work. The church will speak about in Laborans Exercens by John Paul II, the reality that the work that we do, the labor that we give, is an act of service to one another and to God. And so our work, be mindful always to do your work well. I can't stress that enough. My generation, so to speak, more you guys' generation, I'm afraid to say, millennials versus Generation Xers, I guess is what I am. We're accused of being lazy, and pretty much all agree. I do know a lot of my 30-year-old somethings who, the idea of working 40 hours a week is it's pretty overwhelming for them. I don't know what that looks like because I've never worked that little in basically my adult life. But the reality is less and less people are desiring to work full-time jobs. They want to work generally 20 to 30 hours a week maybe, but also get full-time benefits and also get full-time vacations and all those things. That's not going to happen. So tell your friends, just start working, because it ain't going to. Trust me, we're not going to give you the money to let you live that lifestyle. I mean, that's just the reality. But we have a responsibility to give an honest day's work. And that can't be underscored, because it is so imperative that I know in your working situations, maybe there's people around you that don't do their job. Or maybe they're on the internet the entire day, not actually doing anything. They're just watching, YouTube videos or whatever. Jason's back there shaking his head like, yep, that's what Deacon Staling does every day. Put in a full day's work. That's demanded by us as a Christian duty. The church will then speak about a right of every human has a right to economic initiative. This is a basic human right, and so we have to promote as a worldwide global institution. The Catholic Church is going to fight for the rights of workers. You will always see us on the side of laborers, trying to give people the opportunity to work, trying to give everybody the opportunity to make their own, to do their own, to earn their own. And this is something that we need to encourage here in the United States. Don't look for the government to tell people to work. That's obviously not working. We've seen an exponential increase in the amount of welfare we're paying and the amount of food stamps we're giving out, etc. We as individuals have to go out and encourage people to earn a daily wage. And we can do that by, in our own businesses, maybe that you run, having more, small part-time positions for a few young people who just need a step into the industry that you're in. Or if you've got massive amounts of, gains, net gain every year, you could probably employ maybe 300 or 400 more people. That's not a bad thing. It means you're going to have to give up some of your private jet time, but that's probably going to be okay, because you're giving other people the opportunity to do which is they're created to do, which is to give glory to God through their work. So we want to go on to the demands of justice, and I want to just draw a few corollaries between the responsibility of the state and the responsibility of business, because oftentimes the two are the same. But I started with the first principle of responsibility of the state in regulating economic activity and labor as being obeying the rule of subsidiarity. Like I said last week, this is the higher institution not usurping the rights of the lower institution. So the basic cell of human society is the family. This is saying the local government does not have a right to come into my home and tell me how to order the life of those who live in my home. Now, if there's egregious offenses against human dignity, like you're living in squalor, or you're beating your children, or you don't ever actually feed your children, now, yes, the state has a responsibility to come help you. Your neighbor actually has the first responsibility to do that, to step in and say, hey, what are you doing to your family? Why are y'all living this way? You look to the neighbor to do that first. But this rule of subsidiarity, I put that first because realistically, the government should not have to step in to the situation of the workplace unless every other option has been exercised. So just working conditions. The expectation would be that the business would give everybody a just working condition. We know that doesn't always happen. That's what Rerum Novarum focuses quite a bit of its attention on, is working conditions for human labor. And the rise of the modern industrial era, it was not uncommon that people died every day at work. That's why they had signs that said last day since death, or since dead at work, or last day since an injury. Now they count hours, like millions of hours though. We go millions of hours without people dying. Thanks be to God. But OSHA is what we have in America that kind of helps regulate this. But every business owner has that same responsibility. That's why we have tacky, pink tape on these steps. It hurts my eyes every time I walk down here, but people have fallen. And we have a responsibility to warn you as best we can that there are steps that you could fall down as you exit, that part of the church into this lower part of the church. That's safe working conditions. But the state only needs to step in when it's an objective reality that the business is not providing safe working conditions. There can be areas of prudential judgment where one company does something different than another company. Go back to my dad. My dad, for 38 years of his 44 years with Lone Star Steel, wore denim Wranglers, a denim Wrangler shirt, leather gloves. He should have worn his helmet more often. He usually just wore the glasses because he got like slag in he got pieces of metal in his ear and on his face. So wasn't the best thing. It's his fault though. They told him put your helmet on. So he worked in that. And then the new company, U.S. Steel, came in and told him, hey, guess what? You have to wear all that plus a fire retardant suit. You can imagine the joy of my father of working in all denim, a fire retardant suit, and a 130-degree steel mill in the middle of East Texas in the summer. He did not like this new company, but did he do what he was told to do? Absolutely, because that was their regulations. And that's just prudential judgment. They felt like the fire retardant suit was something that was needed. Okay, not a big deal. The government doesn't need to step in and tell them, you do this and you do that. It's respecting the autonomy of the business. The next point is just wages. It would be expected that a business would provide a wage that is just in accords with the dignity and the amount of work that a person is doing. I believe the current wage in our country is $7.25, if I remember correctly. And in the state of California, I believe it's $10, and it might be moving up to $12 or something like that. Cost of living is more expensive. Just wages are based not just on what you're producing, but what you're doing, how often you're doing it. Just wages accord with what other things you have to do in your life. You know, the church speaks in Rerum Novarum and likewise after that about how wages don't just accord with that which you're doing in that specific moment, in that specific time, but to give you a wage that affords you the benefit of improving your mental, your psychological, your physical well-being. So, okay, maybe moving rocks, which is what I did for 4 years. Moving rocks, not the most glorious of work, but it's hard work, and it absolutely was physically demanding. I got paid pretty good money for a kid. I got paid under the table $12 an hour in cash. It's pretty awesome. I would take that wage today too. You know, all of us should. That's pretty good money. But I worked and earned, and that $12 accorded with the work I was doing, and it afforded me the opportunity to do other things, to go and travel. When I was in high school, I was able to fly on my own. I didn't have to ask Mom and Dad for money to go to California. I just said, I'm going to go to California. I earned enough money. They said, okay, seems reasonable to me. I have family out there, don't worry. But having a wage that accorded with those things that would help me be benefited, to really grow from that, instead of a wage that strictly corresponds with what I'm doing. Because the reality is the world does not value the work of the street sweeper nearly as much as it values the work of the nuclear physicist. But if the streets go unswept for a couple weeks, what happens? We're all miffed. If the nuclear physicist doesn't show up for a couple weeks, what happens? Sorry, nuclear physicists. In case you're on the YouTube. We realize that our work isn't just, the value is not given to it by how the world perceives it. It's given that value by who we are. And so just wages are expected. The state has a responsibility to step in only when those wages are so egregiously unjust that a person's not even able to live, so to speak, week to week or check to check. That a person is not able to grow some kind of savings. The church asks the government to get involved at that point. She'll petition the government. She'll work as a body, as an institution to say, please recognize this body of laborers is getting severely underpaid, and we need to work against that. But the state and businesses should always be looking to do those things. The state's other responsibilities that the church recognizes is promoting employment opportunities. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like if the nation has excess money, which our nation never does, so let's just face that reality real quick. But if we had excess money to grow opportunities for business, but what they can do in a world where we don't have an excessive amount of state money, what we can do is encourage individual businesses to expand their workforces. We can encourage, and it doesn't mean by force, it means literally that, an encouragement for your state representative to call that big industry that's in the city that has tons and tons of, it's just making hand over fist money and saying, hey, you thought about expanding your workforce maybe by 40 people? That's non-confrontational, that's something that's just, that's something the government can step in and do. But providing an environment in which businesses are oriented to offer more employment opportunities as they grow. And finally, and I use again this word specifically, is limited regulation of business. The church recognizes that in justice, the marketplace, as said before, it has no conscience. The law of the market does not have a human conscience. And so the state stands in to regulate the marketplace in a very limited way, basically to guide it towards the common good. Not to work for this specific group of individuals or that specific group of individuals, or to work for this party or that party, to work for the common good. And so when the state steps in to regulate business, it's not so that it can get in bed with the Democrats or the Republicans or the Green Party or the Independents or whomever. The state steps into the regulation of business to promote the overall common good. Not looking at individual enterprises. You know, a very easy thing to pick on in terms of regulation of business is energy right now. The state has stepped in time and time again and restricted the production of coal in certain states, or restricted this type of natural gas, or this or that or the other. Is it necessary for the state to interfere in all those things? So far it's been very challenging to prove. The common good needs to be protected. If those practices are literally destroying human lives and people's ability to, grow, yeah, that's an issue. But if it's not, if it's just a perceived problem, we need to be more objective in how we address those issues. I'm always out there. I've made no bones about it. I'm a big fan of nuclear energy. I think we should build more nuclear power plants. You can put employees in them. They're pretty dang safe. You don't have problems unless you want problems. So that's my pitch for nuclear energy. And it's one of those energies that's pretty friendly, pretty renewable, and generally speaking doesn't require a whole lot. I mean, it's one big construction job and then it's done. And then you just make sure it doesn't blow up. That'll employ people for a long time, though. I want to move on finally, because it is 8:30. I just want to move on. I'll skip that last piece, the common vision of the common good. The problem that we experience today is that there's no common vision of the common good. Individuals have totally become totalitarian. So my vision of what is good has to be everybody else's vision of good. There's no objectivity there, right? So it becomes a perverted form of communism, basically. So what do we see? The challenges in our modern democratic state: healthcare, wages and hours, rights and privileges. And I'll address these a little bit next week in our final conversation on social justice, but I'll give you these thoughts to think about. Healthcare, is it a basic human right? Think about it. Write that question down. Is it a basic human right? Does every human being have a right to healthcare? Secondly, wages and hours. Does everybody have a right to a 40-hour-a-week job that pays X amount of money? And thirdly, rights versus privileges. What do you think are some perceived rights that are in reality actually privileges? And what are some privileges that really should be rights? These are kind of homework questions for you to consider as you spend the next week thinking and reading all about these wonderful, wonderful teachings of the church. I will encourage you to look specifically in the Catechism, the section on social teaching, particularly on the economy. The number is 2401, number 2401, and it ends with number 2454. That sounds like a lot. It's 5 pages in the Catechism. It's really not that much. It's basically what we went through this evening. And also to read, if you're going to read any of the one things I suggested, Centesimus Annus, John Paul II, on 100 years, that's what that means. It's the 100-year anniversary of Rerum Novarum. Read numbers 30 through 44. That's a very good critique of the problems of communism, Marxism, socialism, and the problems of a capitalism that puts greed as God. Well, thank you very much. I hope you'll have a good evening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you next week.